Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ben Plays Games. If you ask most Nintendo 64 owners what their first game for the system was, the majority would probably say Super Mario 64. Some of that's down, of course, to it being one of the first games available for the system, but it's also because at the time, it was not only the best 3D platformer ever, but also simply one of the best games ever. And today, I'm going to take a closer look at why. If you enjoy the video, please be sure to hit subscribe, and now, let's take a leisurely stroll through the Mushroom Kingdom. When you think about what makes a great game, you might take into consideration gameplay, graphics, music, or plot, or a combination of all of them, along with other factors more specific to your personal taste. A great game is one that takes those parts, makes them its own, and successfully weaves them together to create a compelling product. But when thinking about whether a game could be classed as extraordinary, you have to take it a step further. Yes, you still need to think about all its different facets, their quality, and if they work well together, but you also have to consider its impact on its genre, and perhaps even its impact in the wider context of video games as a whole. And based off that metric, there's absolutely no doubt that Super Mario 64 is an extraordinary game. In the early 90s, Mario, probably the most recognisable mascot the world over, had a very successful run across the 8 and 16-bit console generations, starring in a series of 2D platformers still considered classics to this day. But heading into the mid-90s, video game companies Nintendo and Sega, as well as newcomers Sony, had begun looking to the future and away from the 2D titles most had become accustomed to over the previous decade. Because with a new generation of hardware on the horizon, the likes of which had never been seen before, it was time to make the jump to 3D. A jump that was perhaps the biggest between any generation before or since, a jump that would change gaming forever. As you'd expect, Nintendo wanted their flagship character to be front and centre when their new console, eventually dubbed the Nintendo 64, or N64 for short, arrived in stores, so they tasked industry legend Shigeru Miyamoto and his talented team with creating the next Mario smash hit. And as if creating a Mario game good enough to kickstart the N64's launch wasn't challenge enough, all the while under pressure from Sega's Saturn and Sony's PlayStation, both equally competent competitors, Miyamoto and his team also had the additional tall order of transitioning that classic Mario gameplay into a completely new dimension as well. There was, however, no need to be concerned about the quality of the final product. Super Mario 64 hit Japanese shelves in June 1996, and it was immediately met with universal praise. In fact, it was so good, many considered it to not only be the blueprint for all 3D platformers to follow, but also the finest example of transitioning a franchise from 2D to 3D full stop, a hurdle so many developers at the time were trying and failing to get over. As to what makes Mario 64 such a marvel, well, there's a whole host of reasons, and I think it makes sense to start with perhaps the most obvious one, its graphics. If you didn't live through the transition from the 16 to 32-bit eras, or weren't an avid gamer at the time, it's difficult to put into words just how monumental a change it actually was. Advancements in graphics featured in later generations have been about adding more polygons, better texturing and improved physics, which are all great advancements to have, but none of them have come even remotely close to the paradigm shift moving from 2D to 3D represented. To put it bluntly, game design hasn't had to fundamentally change to accommodate those features I just listed, but moving from 2D to 3D, it absolutely did. So, when I refer to graphics, I'm talking less about the fine details and more about the shift in perspective as a whole. In 2D Mario games, the objective everything else is built on top of is a very simple one. Move from the left of the screen to the right until you reach the end of the level. Moving to a 3D space in Super Mario 64, that objective no longer properly aligned with how levels could, or should, be designed. In the Crash Bandicoot series, for example, Naughty Dog came up with one way of solving that problem. They created a similar effect in 3D by essentially rotating the levels of a 2D platformer so the player is moving into the screen, into 3D space, rather than from left to right. A novel solution for sure, but one that felt like only a half measure when compared to 3D's true potential. Mario 64, on the other hand, took things a step further and offered up truly open, three-dimensional environments for players to explore. There are no half measures, like in Crash Bandicoot, and there's no hand-holding. Upon loading a new game in Mario 64, you watch a brief introduction, and that's it. You're immediately dropped into a full 3D space and left to your own devices. And at the time, that took some getting used to. No longer were you confined to moving in 4 directions, mainly up, down, left and right, across levels that only progressed by heading in one direction. Instead, you could conceivably pick any direction from a 360-degree angle and head that way, with the newfound sense of exploration completely eliminating the need for the move from left to right to finish level objective to exist at all. Now, you could move around the space on offer just for the fun of it. At the time, this was utterly mind-blowing, and Mario 64's quick and dirty introduction only served to make it all the more revelatory. Once you'd managed to pick your jaw up off the floor enough that you were ready to actually play the game properly, what you found spread out in front of you was environments just begging to be explored, beginning in the grounds of Princess Peach's castle, which we'll come back to later. From there, you're left alone to muddle your way through, hopefully, eventually, making your way inside the castle to begin exploring the 15 or so levels on offer. From this point on, Mario 64 does everything in its power to make every interaction you have with it about moving through its 3D world in one form or another. Nothing demonstrates this more perfectly than the paintings used to enter each level. You don't select where you want to go from a menu, or even a world map, but rather you simply explore the castle until you find one, and then jump in to begin. It's complete adherence to the game's core concept of exploring in a 3D space, and it's a brilliant touch. That concept of exploration is also weaved into how progression is structured, both on a level-by-level basis and across the entire game. Much like Peach's castle, the majority of levels in Mario 64 are non-linear in nature, setting a series of goals for the player to tackle, but goals that don't all need to be completed in a strict order for more levels to become available. By organising progression in such a way, Mario 64 spectacularly breaks away from the linearity of its 2D predecessors in not one, but two ways. The first way is in how objectives within the levels work. For each level, you're given missions to complete, but you're then left to tackle them in any order you choose. Levels therefore become less a series of environments scrolling from left to right, with enemies, pipes and platforms scattered throughout, and more like virtual playgrounds for the player to explore at their whim, not just due to their 3D nature, but because of the way objectives are structured within them. They could quite literally take you in any direction. One moment, you could be scaling the peak in the middle of Bomb-On Battlefield in order to take down its boss. The next, diving into the depths of Dire Docks. It's entirely up to you where you go when you're dropped into a level. The second is how that element of choice is extended to the way progression through the wider game is handled as well. There are some prerequisites that need to be met before certain levels open up, for example by collecting a certain number of stars, but once you've unlocked a level, there's nothing that says you have to finish it in its entirety before moving on to another. More likely, you'll find yourself moving back and forth between earlier and later levels as you hone your skills or figure out how to collect a previously out of reach star. Combine this with the option to pick your objective in each level, and the complete transition from 2D to 3D in terms of structure is complete. In the past, you'd move through levels to move through worlds to move through the game, but now, the world's your oyster. Of course, the non-linear structure and the way it encourages exploration could be the most exciting thing in the world to begin with, but it would ultimately fall flat if Mario 64's levels weren't actually that fun to navigate. Things start out simple enough with Bomb-On Battlefield and Womp's Fortress giving the player more room to work off their training wheels, but soon enough, boundaries at the edges of levels become less frequent, making falling to your death a very real possibility, and the levels themselves become far more complex too. Tiny Huge Island features dual paintings that change Mario's size depending on which one he uses, and Tick-Tock Clock's obstacles change their movement speed depending on what time the painting displays when you jump in. Mario 64 is constantly playing with the way it presents the 3D space around the player to keep them engaged, and it's a wonderful thing to witness. And that playfulness extends to smaller challenges as well. For example, there's a few times you take on giant slides, which as an aside I find particularly interesting. Despite being handled in 3D, they bear more resemblance to the 2D games as their challenges centred around moving directly from one point to another. Whether these are included as a contrast or perhaps even a palette cleanser compared to the larger 3D environments I couldn't say, but they do a great job of reminding you how much Miyamoto and the team shattered expectations when they could have taken a much easier path, or slide. You also find hidden rooms, never-ending staircases, and may even spend a minute or two chasing down a rabbit. What you need to remember with both the larger and smaller flourishes on display here is that Nintendo arguably didn't need to do either. Mario 64 was one of the first 3D platformers, and there was absolutely no precedent set in terms of what kind of quality Miyamoto and his team should have been aiming for. They could have taken a level like Tick-Tock Clock, removed the changing time feature and made obstacles entirely static, and it still would have been amazing in the context of people's expectations at the time. They could have turned Tiny Huge Island into regular-sized island and done away with the dual painting concept entirely, and I bet the level still would have gone down a storm. But they did neither. Instead, they went beyond what could have ever reasonably been expected, and what you end up with is not just a perspective that's game-changing, you also end up with levels so perfectly designed to take advantage of that perspective, levels with so many intricate, clever little details, that every other 3D platformer released around the same time seemed completely bland in comparison, even if they were enjoyable experiences in their own right. The last thing I want to take a look at is Mario 64's controls. Everything else I've talked about so far has been focused more on space and structure, the idea of 3D providing an entirely new way of framing basically everything. but where space and structure had to be completely reconsidered with the arrival of 3D, as evidenced primarily by the removal of the move left to right to finish objective, Mario's controls were designed to help players move fluidly through the environment even in 2D, and as such, needed less a complete reinvention and more of a touch-up. You may have noticed I've used the word transition several times when referring to areas discussed previously moving from 2D to 3D. That's because they still had to be a core part of the Mario experience, but exist in a completely redefined state, unrecognisable from their 2D roots, to work in 3D. Put simply, they had to be rethought, rather than translated to work from a new perspective. I believe Mario 64's controls, rather than a transition, is more of a case of translating, taking another language, or design philosophy in this case, and making it work anew. And speaking of anew, I think there are some who would disagree with me and argue that Mario 64's controls should be looked at as new. There are a wealth of new moves to get to grips with, covering everything from double and triple jumps to punches and ground pounds, and they can all be chained together to create a fantastic feeling of momentum as you move through your environment. At times it's almost fighting game-esque in the way it makes you move frantically from input to input. But nevertheless, while I would say Nintendo did a staggeringly good job, I mean, how many other platformers throughout the entire 32-bit generation handled movement as well as Mario 64? It's still evolution rather than revolution. And it's not without its issues at times, namely down to the camera that constantly follows you from behind. In one way, that camera itself is in fact a revolution, as it allows you to shift the perspective to whatever's best suited for what you're about to do, something not needed with any 2D title whatsoever. Unfortunately, at times it can also be somewhat unwieldy, but I never really understood the level of hate it received. After all, there are only a few 3D platformers that have ever managed to get their camera right to this day, so I find it hard to justify that as a true letdown in what's otherwise a sea of impeccable decisions. Because that's what this game's controls are, impeccable, and if there's one thing the recently released Mario Odyssey proved when it continued to build on that moveset first seen in 1996, it's that Mario 64's controls are timeless. What everything I've spoken about during this video boils down to is that in the mid-90s, Miyamoto and his team didn't have a bar to raise, as there simply wasn't any discernible bar to measure themselves against. So to see just how far they took the concept of a platformer in 3D at a time when there weren't examples to build upon is frankly remarkable. They could have cut corners or spent less time on the project and simply created a great game. And even then it's one we'd likely still be talking about to this day as one that nailed the move from 2D to 3D. But instead, they went those extra few steps further, and in the process created something absolutely extraordinary, a 3D platformer that didn't just reinvent its genre, but helped reinvent video games as a whole. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the video, I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.